when they become aware of the pain of being alone. It
Mm.
seems to be something universally quite painful for most of us.
Mm.
And some people are really good at tuning that out. But insofar as you can help someone see that they're actually alone, there's like some sense of togetherness, but there's no genuine togetherness. Like we're not actually in contact. That's often a very powerful point of entry to help people decide to forego some of their habitual ways of avoiding things and sticking the head in the sand.
Mm. That's a good point. That seems to be the word as well. That seems to be, when I point that out, that seems to, yeah, have quite a shift. I think that seems like quite a lonely experience for you. Like even the pointing out that it has taken a long time for them to share something with me, or that they, acknowledge they have feelings in not sharing with someone else in their life. Like the pointing out of how that leads to loneliness or disconnection or a holding back.
Mhm.
Right. I think, yeah, you're right. Then the pain of that, right, that then allows the pain of that to become more apparent. And
Yeah.
then the experiencing of the pain of that is more likely, I guess, to link to the initial kind of set of injuries, if we put
Mhm.
it that way. Or like it's yeah, and then that is, so what you're saying is that you've found that that is quite a motivating force in terms of now wanting to be able to work towards
Mhm.
better connection, better intimacy.
Well, it becomes the motivating force to give up status quo. Yeah.
Right. Right.
Yeah, like sometimes I'm looking at a patient and they're guarded in their own way. There's 1,001 ways of being guarded, but they're guarded in their own way. And I might say to them, do you realize that you're the most important person in my life for this whole session? There's nothing but you. I'm undividedly focused on you, and yet you're alone. Like, do you realize that? And so that often is a point of entry where people can begin to experience the pain of the status quo.
Mm.
You're not my mom, even though at some
Mm.
level unconscious, maybe I've distorted you into that. And
Yeah,
then
yeah, yeah.
the concomitant expectations are totally out of whack. They're totally inappropriate to the actual situation, the actual relationship. With my mom, when I was 7 years old, it was entirely appropriate for me to expect her to be an extension of me and my needs. Totally appropriate
Mm. Mm.
in terms of that situation. Speaking of various
Mm.
premises, Daniel, in terms of your book there. Um, but now, if I apply that premise to this
Mm.
situation and I'm not even aware of it, things go really funky in relationships. Well, yeah, I don't think there's such a thing as golden mental health. We're always going to be works in progress.
Mm.
So I think the best we can shoot for is that there's less of a distortion, that there might always be
Mm.
a raw place in me, a tender, raw place in me around things around my mother not having been there for me in ways that I've wanted. And I might always have those longings and pangs and when I enter certain relationships, but I'll have the wherewithal to realize, yes, I'm having some hurt feelings right now or negative feelings or whatever it might be. But you have the wherewithal to realize it's not really about Aspasia. She's just tripping
Mm.
a wire. It's
Mm.
the lever that was pulled, but it isn't really about her. And so that
Mm.
way you don't burden your adult relationships with the unresolved conflicts from your childhood.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, see, when you say it like that, it's all very simple. Like that lands very squarely with me, and I understand that in very simple terms. There's something about what happens.
Is being scattered.
Mm.
And the only way you can think, and then I'll close my point, the only way you can think about these global issues is in terms of isness, not suchness. And that is the cause of philosophical melancholia for him, which we today may associate with a lack of mental health.
Really,
And
the pleasure principle yielding to the reality principle, that's a big ask. Most people structure their lives to just feel better for the moment as opposed to really getting better, which requires facing pain. It's,
Mm.
it's a tall order, tough sales pitch. Concepts can be organs of perception as opposed to blinders and cushions and buffers. Is that accurate, Daniel?
perfect. That's exactly right.
Okay. Just to make this very concrete, could you give an example of where approaching otherness uh, and then being armed with a certain conceptual understanding of something might actually lead to greater perceptivity?
Oh, that's an excellent question. So let's, for example, we use that that popular example that everyone may receive in marital counseling of the love languages from Gary Chapman, right? This idea that people have different love languages. Some people think it's loving to receive a gift. Other people think it's loving to have quality time. We'll use that. So your entire life, all you've ever encountered is the idea that quality time is love. And in fact, if people need gifts, they're materialistic. And that's the complete opposite of love. Well, you come on somebody whose love language is gifts and you're spending quality time with them and they're not happy. And you find out that they like gifts.
To encounter someone with something different, they can come to see that there's just difference, and that's okay. That's fine. But maybe in encountering that difference, they also open up the possibility within themselves that perhaps it's not actually my love language. Perhaps this is some defensive structure over the, like, as an example, over the top of something else underneath. Like the questioning of oneself in the meeting of difference is also important. And so, yes, there can be a way that people fear that and so resist even meeting difference, which is important. But then also in the meeting of difference, can you do it in such a manner that there is a way to interrogate, like, is this fundamentally who I am? Do I have something that my love language is gifts and nothing will ever compete? Or is that defensive on top of something else? And this is inviting me to look at that.
Yeah, otherwise the fear of being engulfed by
Yeah.
the otherness is going to make the whole endeavor impossible, and you'll retreat into isolationism and so on and so forth. So there has to be a way of conquering that fear. And the only thing I can think of is learning how to develop the confidence that you are not going to be annihilated or obliterated or engulfed in that otherness. There's a way of staying open to it, even embracing it without loss of self, without giving up an iota of your autonomy.
And that is that's like in the therapy room, right? The corrective emotional experience. That is part of what is being offered there.
Right.
Right.
Because the relationships in where we were hurt, they were never of that kind. It was always some injury to our autonomy, or there was some form of neglect, or there was just wasn't room for us or whatever.
And so it's this sort of terror of the other. So I'm here obviously with Daniel Garner of OG Rose and Johannes Keating. We are going to talk about, well, I'm still interested in the same old thing. So I'm still interested in what's going on in therapy. What is it about this particular form of therapy that I use at the moment that is so helpful, I find? And I've been thinking about, well, I guess the link between that and what that might tell us about sort of what is true, what is real. Very, very, very big questions. But there's something about this form of therapy that, in my mind, it helps to dismantle these like defensive structures. And in doing so, the person is getting in contact with something, or there's a clarity that takes place. And I'm curious about a clarity of what? Like, what might that tell us about some of these more fundamental questions, I guess, of the true and the real? And getting clearer and feeling more opened up, and defensive mechanisms being dismantled. What is it that we're getting more in touch with, is I guess my question. So I brought the two of you together because you're just some of my favorite people to talk to. So I really don't care what we talk about. But also just a sense that in bringing you together, I think it'll be a great conversation. I think you both have really solid, interesting perspectives on things. I've learned a lot from both of you. And so I just thought we'll talk and learn about cornholes and reality.
Bing songs and reality.
Both things and theme songs. So so that's my attempt at an introduction. Yeah. So I think I'll just pass it over to whoever wants to jump in first.
You had a conversation with us, Basia, that I listened in on. And in that conversation, you said that philosophy and learning how to philosophize, learning how to think critically is a bit of a psychological immune system. I think it relates to what you were just talking about, but if you'd like to elaborate, I would love to hear more about that.
Oh, that's magnificent. For me, I'm very influenced by the last essay in The Conflict of Mind on deconstructing common life has a lot to do with David Hume. And David Hume, who I think is much more than just the guy who woke Kant up from his dogmatic slumber. What David Hume is constantly concerned about is how if you have to engage in philosophy because you are going to live according to some ideas and something that somebody teaches you. And if you're not able to think about them, then you get absorbed into that power structure and you're very manipulatable. One of the things that I don't think, in my opinion, is connected enough between David Hume's philosophy is his work as a historian. And what is he spending all of his time as a historian doing? He's seeing how governments manipulate people, how religion manipulates people, how ideology controls people. And he sees that when people don't have philosophy, they're a victim, they don't have any self-defense to the ideas of the system. And I think this has actually only become more and more pressing as a problem with the internet and news and globalization and all these different things. But here's the other trick. He's like, wait a minute, you need philosophy in order to self-defend. But do you know what philosophy also does? It disconnects you from common life because you have abstract ideas of the world. So the very thing that you need to defend yourself is also the risk of disembodying you from the world. And his whole philosophy, and I would say, and I'll close with that, the Scottish Enlightenment, the Counter-Enlightenment, all of this is kind of orbiting this massive problem of needing philosophy as self-defense, but philosophy is also a risk to basically mental health or communal bonds or all these different things. And I think that tension has not been appreciated enough by the modern world.
Right, right. I think Wittgenstein would agree with you there, eh?
Yes,
Yeah,
absolutely.
of course. Yeah, no, my mind goes to this thing about how that which we are not conscious of is liable to control us. I think that's what you were speaking to, Daniel, and you in your own way earlier, Aspasia, about psychotherapy and how that can be a stripping down process that yields, on a good day, lots of clarity. So my 2 cents on that bit, Aspasia, is that clearing out or at least a good portion of our emotional baggage and unresolved feelings is a bit of a prerequisite for being able to uh, think in a sober fashion. So I see the work of psychotherapy as being able to put you into a position where you then can think things through in a clear and sober fashion.
It's clearer why? That's still my question. It's clear, like, it's clearer because it's more in contact with thought coming from where. Like, so I understand sort of it's stripping away these sort of structures through which interpretation is occurring, right? And I understand all that, but then what is that telling us about, like, what is it exactly we then become in better contact with, or we are? Yeah, that's where I'm curious.
Well, I see it as clearing out a kind of distortion filter insofar as we have all of these past feelings and memories and unresolved traumas that are swept underneath the rug, then our perception of the world and ourselves and other people are likely somewhat distorted because it's going through all of that filtering. And so the more we can clean that up, we're in a better position to be in contact with how things really are.
Yes, with the how things really are. This is the bit. This is the bit. So we're in. I guess I'm just wrestling at the bottom level of it about how things really are. Maybe that's really all. That's just a small question, you know. It's that so that allows us better contact with how things really are.
Right. Yeah, like you're not my mom, even though at some level unconscious, maybe I've distorted you into that. And the concomitant expectations are totally out of whack. They're totally inappropriate to the actual situation, the actual relationship. With my mom, when I was 7 years old, it was entirely appropriate for me to expect her to be an extension of me and my needs. Totally appropriate in terms of that situation. Speaking of various premises, Daniel, in terms of your book there. But now if I apply that premise to this situation and I'm not even aware of it, things go really funky in relationships.
Yeah. And so Yeah, there is a direction I want to move into, which is probably more therapy related. But if we just stick with this point for now, the clearing away of that, I guess the question is also like how much of that can really be cleared away. And then does it just get replaced with something else? Like, is there some, like how clear can clear be?
That's a good
Just a
question.
small question, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's sort of where my mind goes. It's not even a question I imagine people could answer, but
Right.
that, yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know if that brings up anything for either of you. But
Well, yeah, I don't think there's such a thing as golden mental health. We're always going to be works in progress. So I think the best we can shoot for is that that there's less of a distortion, that there might always be a raw place in me, a tender, raw place in me around things around my mother not having been there for me in ways that I've wanted. And I might always have those longings and pangs and when I enter certain relationships, but I'll have the wherewithal to realize, yes, I'm having some hurt feelings right now or negative feelings or whatever it might be. But you have the wherewithal to realize it's not really about Aspasia. She's just tripping a wire. It's the lever that was pulled, but it isn't really about her. And so that way you don't burden your adult relationships with the unresolved conflicts from your childhood.
Yeah, see, when you say it like that, it's also very simple. Like that lands very squarely with me, and I understand that in very simple terms. There's something about what happens. But I think you were going to say something, Daniel. But I go down some kind of rabbit hole in trying to understand, though. In other forms of therapy, you can't do that like that, Johannes. Like you can't. Well, I haven't. Like you can't get in there. And I know a big component of that is just the unconscious, like the psychoanalytically informed nature of this therapy. But there is so much as well that I'm thinking through around I think the use of the imagination and that kind of component and the impulse and the connection into emotion and all these things are there's something about those that I'm still stewing over. But I'll pass it to you, Daniel. I know
No, this is all outstanding. So there's a few things. David Hume was very concerned. You know, he has this famous critique of the is ought, where he says you can never get from ought to is. Very important. What he's saying is that if you're going to get to ought, it must be from suchness. And what he means by that is he's watched the entire world basically where someone in a distant land says, I know what a cat is. And I can tell you based on this general definition that is in an abstract realm of concepts, what every cat ought to do. And this becomes a license of tyranny. Because I don't have to encounter your particular cat in your particular suchness. I can, from a definition of isness, then have an assertion of power on oughtness. And so what David Hume really wants to do is stop philosophy that's based on an ontology of an abstract isness and instead base it in a very concrete suchness. And then philosophy is in the business of creating the clearing for the encounter of that suchness. Now, Mr. Hume's argument, in my opinion, was not appreciated. And he basically was warning you that if philosophy heads down this road of isness, we're going to get totalitarian, and you got the Enlightenment that led to the World Wars and World War II, and that's all based on isness, and we're still living philosophy according to isness, which you could also situate in at least the popular understanding of Kant, which is the noumenon phenomenon. We can have these mental categories of isness, and they're very a posterior categories by which we can understand the world. And David Hume is like, no, because thought can never replace suchness. You can never, from a definition of a cat, get to what Aristotle might call the definitive cat, that is Mr. Squiggles down by the barn. Mr. Squiggles must be found in his suchness, not from the isness. Now, the reason why this is very important is because if philosophy has something to do with getting away from distortion, then the question is, are we getting away from distortion for isness or for suchness? David Hume says everyone thinks it's for isness, and if we go down that road, we're done for. We're in huge trouble, and it's going to. And also, funny enough, he talks about melancholia. He calls it philosophical melancholia at the beginning of the Treatise of Human Nature, because for Mr. Hume, today we make a distinction between like philosophy and mental health and psychology and all these. He did not. he basically saw philosophy as in the business of mental health, of which was connected with communal health and social health, of which was all tied to your ability to not be manipulated by power or by what other people think you should do, or all of these different things. But it had to be in service of what words he'll use is things like sentiment, common life. It's not individualistic, it's philosophy for your lived common life. The problem is there's a middle ground that has been lost between, the great collective and the individual. Like today in America, especially, it's either individualism or the collectivism, right? David Hume's like, no, he didn't want to end up in like a Descartesian Cartesianism where philosophy leads to this radical isolationism. He sees that as a problem because he's saying you're still locating your philosophy in the head. But then he's looking over at the philosophy of isness and he's like, well, now that's off in some abstract realm. We need to bring it to the common life. And that's the suchness. And what he's talking about is the need of maintaining your understanding that your definition of self comes from your experience, from your emotional, from your relations, from your community, from your traditions, from all of these different things. And he wants to defend that space of the kind of social, of the family and the relational and these different things. And he sees as philosophy is increasingly necessary in a world that's more and more connected, because he's looking at the trade routes, the Dutch Empire. He's obviously where he's living in Scotland, you have the British Empire, Great Britain turning into, he's seeing this growing nation state. So he's like, wow, under these conditions, it's going to be really, really difficult to maintain communal life and by extension, mental health, because increasingly you're worrying about what the British Empire is doing far away that you've never met. You're hearing about America, your brain is being scattered. And the only way you can think, and then I'll close my point, the only way you can think about these global issues is in terms of isness, not suchness. And that is the cause of philosophical melancholia for him, which we today may associate with a lack of mental health. And so for him, the question of philosophy and fighting distortion has a lot to do with honoring and maintaining suchness, your lived experience and your relations, and not getting swept up in things basically you have no control of, or stuff that must maintain as an abstract category. But then this is where the conflict of mind comes in, because if all you're hearing all day long is if you don't care about these issues elsewhere, the world's going to end. You also have stuff, DC controls your life in Virginia. There's all of this stuff happening. This has made it incredibly difficult to do what David Hume is talking about. You can get into media technologies and different things, but I think his warning is still very much alive.
So Daniel, I think you spelled it out. I just want to make sure I'm tracking you. The difference between isness and suchness. Are you saying that isness in this context is a conceptual definition of what is, and suchness is the actual contact and lived experience of the thing?
Yes.
Okay, I thought so. I see. So you're outlining a major concern with getting a conceptual Charlie horse, if you will, of losing contact with the actual living world through a prism of concepts and ideas. Is that accurate?
Yes.
I see. So if I may pursue and pull on that thread, so if that is the major concern, how come we shouldn't simply put down the philosophy book and go meditate if that's the case?
Oh, it's an excellent question, because you're increasingly finding yourself under a government that's telling you how you should live. You have, certain rights. You should relate to a pluralistic world. David Hume, David Hume. So that's exactly right, and is actually why, for me, you got to go from Hume to Hegel, and Hegel's actually going to get you, if you follow Hegel, not in the Marxist tradition, but in the tradition of, I know we were talking about growth with the precept and the percept and participant. That's all Hegel, and for Hegel, reality is an interpenetrating relationship between the subject and reality. There's not a division, and what we don't want to distort is the creative act of our participation in reality. Now that's a giant mouthful, but the thing we don't want to distort is our active participate in reality. It's not divided between a noumenon and a phenomenon. We as subjects, literally, like colors or the rainbow in Owen Barfield, that's a great example. Like does a rainbow exist? you know, a rainbow, you have to have rain, sunlight, subject, like color for growth, that you actively participate in the existence of a rainbow. And the key to a rainbow, the reason why I like the rainbow example is because it's a mixture of the idea and the actual that you can only get with both. Like you have to have the mind and the subject and the positioning in the real world to get that mixture of relationship that creates reality and conditionality. But to your point, like to stick to that question, we can't get rid of philosophy because we're encountering otherness. And in pluralism, you're running into people you've never met. You were born a Christian. That's your common life. That's what you've ever thought. And then you run into the atheist. And now you have to ask yourself, why am I a Christian? Well, bam, now you're in philosophy. So David Hume, if you're not careful, leads into basically isolationism. It would get us a little bit into politics. It leads to Duginism, Alexander Duginism, fourth political theory, bifurcation of the global world, and it will lead to the breakdown of global trade and economics as we know it. Now, I'm not saying those things are all necessarily good or bad, but you see, David Hume is going to leave you more isolationist, because philosophy, as Belonging Again tries to argue, philosophy becomes unavoidable once you get pluralism. Once you encounter difference, you are automatically destabilized. And even if you don't even want anything to do with pluralism, with philosophy, you're automatically a philosophical being. And Peter Berger put it very well when he said, we're all existentialists now. Peter Berger was the great sociology of the 70s. He's writing about the changing conditions of a world where everyone who is different is interacting with pluralism. He says, what's this going to do is the average person will turn into an existentialist. And he says, this is really risky, though, and this gets into Philip Reef, and I'll close the point, is because when people are existentially overwhelmed, what do they turn to? Strong men. They turn to totalitarianism, and that's exactly what has happened. And so the world today, in 2000, like, and this is kind of my big shift in 2016, where I was like, well, I guess we're done with Hume. Hume was right. And it's like, no, the political ramifications. And that's where I started Belonging Again. So basically, we can't put down philosophy because we're in a pluralistic world. And if we don't do philosophy, we become susceptible to totalitarianism.
Isn't that relationship just in general, though? Like, just a really brief point. Like, you know, sure, pluralism, but I mean, ultimately, two people will have a difference.
Yes, yeah, it is absolutely the same situation. It manifests in pluralism because you have to, in the kind of core Tani sense of the capital nation state, have a big enough of a state to support a global network in the Navy, which then means you can appeal to that power structure. And the bigger you are dealing with pluralistic nations, the more people are likely to do that. And so, but what you're describing, that I just had a lovely paper we're putting in the Science of Logic anthology on Leibniz and the analysis of Citas, where he says all relations, people come into relations because generally they think they're similar, but similarity is what you must think is basically the same when they're apart. Like, he describes two apples as similar as if you saw one in a different room than the other, you would think it was the other apple. That's why they're similar. You can confuse them with one another. So the only way to tell that they're not the same apple is to put them next to one another. But here's the trick. The moment you see them next to one another, what emerges? Difference. Difference. So similarity lures people into a situation where the difference comes out, and then it's shocking. Because the whole reason they came together is because they thought they weren't different. But actually, that mechanism that Leibniz, I would refers to as metageometry, and that the great Anthony Morley describes very well. That's absolutely what occurs in marriage. And you can look at pluralism as basically where all the nations are in a kind of relationship. They're absolutely in a marriage. It's that Leibniz situation now on the global theater.
My mind is going places, but Aspasia, I want to...
No, go, Johannes, please.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So if I'm wrapping my head around this, it sounds like there are contexts where dropping the conceptual interpretive lens is the way to go to be in more contact. But there are other contexts when we approach others in differences where concepts can be organs of perception as opposed to blinders and cushions and buffers. Is that accurate, Daniel?
Perfect. That's exactly right.
Okay. Just to make this very concrete, could you give an example of where approaching otherness and then being armed with a certain conceptual understanding of something might actually lead to greater perceptivity?
Oh, that's an excellent question. So let's, for example, we use that popular example that everyone may receive in marital counseling of the love languages from Gary Chapman, right? This idea that people have different love languages. Some people think it's loving to receive a gift. Other people think it's loving to have quality time. We'll use that. So your entire life, all you've ever encountered is the idea that quality time is love. And in fact, if people need gifts, they're materialistic. And that's the complete opposite of love. Well, you come up on somebody whose love language is gifts, and you're spending quality time with them, and they're not happy. And you find out that they like gifts. Well, without philosophy, what's very likely you're going to do is say, oh, well, they're materialistic and they're a bad person. And in fact, I shouldn't hang out with them because they're a materialistic person, and their materialistic ethics may rub off on me. And so because you don't have the idea of love languages, you then shut out that relationship that actually may have been perfectly fine and perfectly good and maybe had some wonderful benefits, but you're going to shut yourself off from it because by definition, whatever you value is not a value. Without philosophy, it is the value. Love is quality time without philosophy. It's not a possibility. No one experiences their worldview as a worldview per se. We experience it as the view of the world. Like, it is the way to see things. That's the problem. Philosophy is when you realize that there are different ways of seeing the world, which of course is automatically terrifying because once you realize there are other ways of seeing the world, then why should you see it the way you do and not other people? And philosophy tends to lead to nihilism. That's what David Hume understood, unless philosophy keeps in the suchness. Like, that's the issue. Like, once the philosophical, he calls it ascent, once the realization that difference is possible occurs, then you start to question your own way of thinking. And if you do that forever, you end up in a melancholia you can never recover from. So he wants to say, well, the reason you think the way you do is because it's based on your community. It's based on your life. But with philosophy, when you encounter someone in your community that sees gift giving as a love language, because you have that philosophy, you're able to go, wait a minute, no, they're just different. They're not a bad person. They're just different. So here's a way to put it. Without philosophy, you really actually, in a way, can't have difference. It's either good or bad. It's not really difference. They're wrong. And that's kind of they're like wrong. They're wrong to find their love language and gifts. So a way to put it is that without philosophy, the encounter of different love languages is an encounter of wrongness. Whereas with philosophy, where you're able to reflect on it, it actually becomes an encounter of difference. So to close that point, pluralism, basically, without philosophy, pluralism is not going to be a collection of difference. It's going to be us versus them. It's going to be right versus wrong, because everyone but you is going to be wrong, right? And so that would be an example of where I think it's very consequential. And then, of course, you just expand that to cultures in general, or how people raise their kids differently, or what people do with their free time. Like, it just goes down the line. You can't experience any of that as having its own grounding in a logic of an individual person's common life, unless you have philosophy to make you reflect on that. And then the last point is, once you then have to be comfortable with your own choices. And this is the hard move. It is really difficult to know that somebody chooses to live their life differently than you. We can talk all day long about how much we like freedom and people should have a right to their own choices. But if you know that your neighbor is homeschooling while you send your kids to a public school, you begin questioning your own choices, and then you start having a mental breakdown, right? It's like, oh my gosh, I don't know. Philosophy is able to go, no, there's actually difference, and it's okay. It's okay. And so philosophy has that really important grounding function as well, once you grasp it. So that's how I would answer your excellent question, Johannes.
Wow. Beautiful response. I think I have a tie-in to psychotherapy, Aspasia. I'll take a stab at it.
Okay.
So I could be wrong about this, but it seems to me that it's possible that we can intellectually grok the difference because we've been trained in philosophy. But emotionally, there's still a place in us that has dominion that insists that it should be quality time over gifts. So we might have the intellectual fiber to realize, okay, this person has that love language and I have this. And so that's where we have to work through our emotions, because otherwise we may have the intellectual wherewithal and understanding, but we will still insist and try to steamroll the other person to adopt our love language, or alternatively we'll become doormats and just try to twist ourselves into pretzels in order to placate the other person. So I think that that's where the work of facing ourselves and working through unresolved emotional conflict comes in, so that we can actually apply the philosophical understandings and not just have them rattling around up here.
Well, I'll just add very quickly, for David Hume, it was a massive mistake to think that if you had the right conclusion, that was the same as having processed yourself to that conclusion. And that's what he was thinking all the philosophers were doing. They're like, oh, we know what's best, therefore that's it. The emotional work is all done. And so when he talks about common life, for him, he wouldn't have known about psychotherapy or different things. When he talks about sentiment, it's like you have to put yourself in the lived experience to gradually attune yourself to the emotions of that difference that you know is there. So for him, the community and the traditions have that work that today something like psychotherapy needs to have, because you don't necessarily have those same communal bonds like a Robert Putnam will talk about. There's no bowling alone, or families or churches are different. So that is exactly right. And just what you were, how, and I'll give it to Aspasia, how you were describing psychotherapy right there, in Hume's mind, that was what something like a community or the church or the religions or different things could actually do. And again, people get on Hume for being an atheist, but actually it's extremely clear. He makes a distinction between good philosophy, good religion, bad philosophy. And the good is the one where the ideas never replace the emotional processing structure and the lived experience to do that kind of work. So I think it was an excellent point you just made.
Well, thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, I think what you were just pointing to, Johannes, was part of what I was trying to point to in our last conversation, Daniel, when I keep sort of harping on about emotions as having a particularly vital place here in terms of indicating something that is maybe not always, but can help to indicate something that is I don't know how to word it. More fundamental, more vital, something that speaks more about. So in your example, Daniel, I can follow all that, the love languages example, but then I still question, well, for this person whose love language is gifts, right? To encounter someone with something different, they can come to see that there's just difference, and that's okay. That's fine. But maybe in encountering that difference, they also open up the possibility within themselves that perhaps it's not actually my love language. Perhaps this is some defensive structure over the, like, as an example, over the top of something else underneath. Like the questioning of oneself in the meeting of difference is also important. And so, yes, there can be a way that people fear that and so resist even meeting difference, which is important. But then also in the meeting of difference, can you do it in such a manner that there is a way to interrogate, like, is this fundamentally who I am? Do I have something that my love language is gifts and nothing will ever compete? Or is that defensive on top of something else? And this is inviting me to look at that. And I see, yes, I see the important role too, I guess, Johannes, of the working through the unconscious emotions and the blockages of those maybe frees us up to be more clear on that part, like on when we encounter difference. Now it's clearer if that's an invitation for us to, like, it opens up possibility as opposed to necessarily needing to be resisted against something like that. That's sort of where my mind is swirling.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think that it opens up the space where that is possible, where we can get to know deeper parts of ourselves and realize that maybe we're more expansive in our preferences or likes or whatever. I think where the rubber hits the road is that if we do that inner work, it will be changing ourselves or realizing differences within ourselves based off of what we thought, in a context where it's not about giving up our autonomy. So it isn't
Mm,
about becoming a chameleon in order to get along better with the other person to accommodate their preferences. It'll be truly a two-person relationship where no one is giving up their autonomy.
mm. Yeah, that links to something else I was thinking about the can't remember what you were saying. You were saying something, Daniel, that made me think this. Uh, the necessity of relationship in all of this. Like obviously, so, but it's both again. So there's some component here that's about getting clearer about oneself, right? And this idea of autonomy, but autonomy only exists in the context of relationship as well. To like it's oh, I know what we were talking about, the sort of why not just go away and meditate all day. There's something though that seems fundamental about us being operating in a way that takes relationship into account. Um, that ties in all of this as well. But I like the autonomy point, because obviously that relates back to attachment, and thinking through what happened there. Mm. But it's
Um,
that it's the wrestling. Yeah, no, it's all right. One more sentence and I'm done.
please.
It's the wrestling with how to know that you are really connecting into something, if we say inside yourself, clearly enough that you can discern that that is yours, as opposed to being one of these defensive structures, or one of these. I think that is something that at least intellectually comes up as well with clients. And I mean, then we obviously pivot away from that, but it is a question that people seem to wrestle with when they're up here a lot, is how would I ever really be able to discern that that is what I want, as opposed to being somewhere underneath the hood, a function of what I believe I need to do for the other person to remain in contact with me, right? And there's levels that you can sort of work to where they can become clearer that lots of stuff has been that, and that's great. But then I think, yeah,
Great
I
question.
guess how clear can we ever be? Like, I mean, like, yeah. Anyway, I'll hand it over to you, Daniel. I'm around the circles in my head.
Outstanding. So a few things first. You said something that was extremely important about the reflection on the self and the potential to change on yourself, or to examine, wait a minute, what if my love language is actually a means of self-deception or things, and so on and so forth. The reason why I think this is extremely important is because if you look at the communal, the way things are, you say, oh well, we just need to get back to givens, get away from pluralism, get back to suchness, independent of relations, networks, and so on and so forth. This is also tied to where people talk about the meaning crisis, because I would argue a lot of the meaning crisis is actually just another language for the philosophical melancholia of David Hume. It's a result of a world stuck in isness, separated from suchness, which means they're also separated from suchness relationships. And now they more so have associations, not emotional connections, and so on. So there's a lot there. One of the things I think is a problem is a lot of people talk about the meaning crisis metaphorically as almost like a dead end. Like we were walking around and we ended up at a dead end, and we turned around and the door slammed behind us, and we're like, oh crap, how did we end up here? It's like a giant mistake. I think it's much better to think of the meaning crisis more so as where we've ended up in a place where we've removed, say, givens or isolationism and things like that, actually because of a moral advancement. Because actually, when we were in a situation where we weren't pluralistic, we were racist, we were xenophobes, we were closed-minded, we were self-righteous. History is a long story of what the conditions of meaning give you, independent of relationship. Like the way Belonging Again describes it is the banality of evil that Hannah Arendt talks about. And for her, describing Nazism, true evil only occurs once it becomes everydayness. It's not really evil, it's just what you do. I mean, what you do is you send the Jews off, or you hate minorities, right? It's not evil, it's everydayness, it's routine, right? Well, what pluralism does is when you encounter people who say, don't mistreat minorities, you go, wait a minute, what if minorities actually are equal as me? And so you actually reflect on that, and it leads to a moral advancement. And here's the thing, where you do not have pluralism, history is a story of getting unreflective people who do terrible things, and because they don't reflect, they can't stop those terrible things, right? But if you then make people reflect on themselves, they tend to go existentially crazy, and then they have these mental breakdowns. So here's the problem. The very thing that increases ethics causes mental illness. That's what we have not taken seriously. The very act of self-reflection that makes us ask questions about ourselves can also lead to an anxiety about our choices that makes us unsure of ourselves. And then we want to just go back to when we didn't have to think. Well, those were the conditions of the banality of evil. So what's really important with the meaning crisis discussion, we actually do have answers to the meaning crisis. Like everyone's talking, oh, we absolutely do. It's called racism. It's called xenophobia. It's called war. It's called isolationism. The issue is we're looking for a new source of meaning that actually is found in relationship, that doesn't go back to old ways of finding meaning, that results in a lack of reflection or relation with difference or encountering otherness. We're looking for being able to maintain meaning and rootedness in the presence of true otherness. You could make the argument I would make is basically this has not occurred in human history. There has been pluralism on the Silk Roads. There have obviously been very diverse societies. You could look at India. But in regard to this question of dealing with the meaning crisis, especially outside of a religious context, this is sociologically incredibly unique. And I think it is part of all of these problems that are being pointed to. So for me, to close the point, we need to think of the meaning crisis more so like a Thomas More. There's a wonderful play called A Man for All Seasons. And Thomas More was the individual who refused to grant King Louis a divorce, who wanted a divorce, and it was against his principles. So he refused to do it. So he got executed. Thomas More, at any point, could have left prison simply by doing that which he believed was immoral in granting the divorce, right? So likewise, we could all right now escape the meaning crisis or all of the meta crisis, all these different things by simply returning to previous historic episodes that resulted in oppression or immorality or closed off to otherness or strongmanning, right? But we're choosing not to. Now, unfortunately, millions of people are choosing to do that. That's why the world is falling back. But there are many people who are trying to look for different things. So for me, that's what you're describing is why we need to stick to the question of pluralism and not retreat from it and figure out how to work with this. But in the working with difference, it requires a certain reflection on yourself. So here's the question then. What reality are you trying to get at in that very act? Because if truth organizes values, and we're saying that we need to stick to pluralism, which is so existentially difficult, and it would be easier just to go back to different things or maybe become anonymous. The question becomes the following. Why? Well, you say because it's more real. Why? How do you know? What is reality then? This is why it's important that relations are ontological. This is why it becomes extremely important that reality itself is not merely something you correspond with, but something you participate in, and your capacity to participate in it creatively in a manner that increases beauty is tied to your capacity to handle otherness and difference and your ability to relate to it. I'll close there. There's more to be said, but those are some thoughts that come to mind.
Mm-hmm. So to my thinking, the psychological tie-in there is that insofar as we are able to face difference and face otherness with an open mind, without closing down with fear and without retreating, there has to be a way of feeling sure that we can face that otherness without loss of self, without loss of autonomy. And so that's where that comes in. And in terms of how do you know that you're making an autonomous choice as opposed to accommodating or defying, I don't know how to explain that, but what I can say is that there's like an experience, much like I couldn't like really tell you about how do you know whether or not you're having an orgasm. It's like, you know, and it's just a sense of being deeply rooted and your mind is very, very clear. You're thinking clearly. All the anxiety has left you. So that's the best I can do in terms of pointing to something, but it's an experience that's very hard to point to.
But that, to me, the fact that it has to be pointed to and you can't describe it in words, that is part of what makes me take that seriously, almost. Like that, I think that is what I'm sort of trying to get at is there is like all the philosophy side of things is so important, but ultimately as well, there is something, there is almost like something that people need to learn to connect into and trust about something that is ultimately wordless as well as part of the guiding system. So the clarity that what's being cleared up is the fog that gets in the way perhaps of having that experience.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, otherwise the fear of being engulfed by the
Yeah.
otherness is going to make the whole endeavor impossible, and you'll retreat into isolationism and so on and so forth. So there
Mm.
has to be a way of conquering that fear. And
Mm.
the only thing I can think of is learning how to develop the confidence that you are not going to be annihilated or obliterated or engulfed in that otherness. There's a way of staying open to it, even
Mm.
embracing it without loss of self, without giving up an iota of your autonomy.
And that is that's like in the therapy room, right? The corrective emotional experience. That is part of what is being offered there.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Because the relationships in where we were hurt, they were never of that kind. It was
Mm.
always some injury to our autonomy, or there was some form of neglect, or there was just wasn't room for us, or whatever.
Mm-hmm. And so it's this sort of terror of the other, right? That outside of therapy, um, how are people navigating this? Like, I mean, outside of going to therapy to work on this, like
Mhm.
what that, I mean, there's that piece that comes into my mind as well.
Mhm.
But it's such a strong motivational system, and it is so under the hood that that it's very difficult to point to for people, I think, that if it's a completely foreign concept. And then this over-reliance on thinking and hyper rationalization and holding on to, you could find a philosopher to back up any way you want to look at the world, right? So you just have to find the one that matches what suits you, and then you can sort of hold on to that. A lot of this to me just goes back to rigidity of any form, which is what I think I was pointing to earlier about the balance piece. It's probably not the right word, but having some flexibility in movement and almost an expectation that you're going to change. Um, as I mean, as you, yeah, I mean, you're necessarily going to change and being open to that, and that's also about encountering difference, and not bumping into it with like a rigid shell around you, but having some flexibility in what you might take from that, or the possibility that that might open up for you as well. And I understand that in order to be able to do any of that, you would need to be able to dismantle it, like the terror that you might hold around the other.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
mm. So, mm. So much of this though goes back to it being unconscious, Johannes. Like,
Mhm. 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 Yeah, that's where I think it starts with facing what feels like the other in yourself.
yeah, that's it.
And you can befriend the parts of you that have been relegated into the unconscious or projected outward, like all these
Mm.
negative qualities or attributes. That's not part of me. It's the immigrants or whatever. Once you can face those parts of yourself, what feels like other in yourself, yeah, I think that maximizes perceptual flexibility and openness and an ability to embrace the world and all its differences.
And it's a big part of that too. Does some of that go to the impulse piece too, though, Johannes? So, like, in terms of if we think about like the aggressive impulse as the example, to be able to face that inside oneself,
Mhm.
right? To be able to see something inside oneself that has been pushed away for so long, or that someone would never consciously expect to be there, and being able to see that is helping to facilitate some of this process too,
Yeah.
of yeah,
Yeah, that's the
yeah.
technology. If I can face that there is evil inside of me, it's not just out there,
Mm,
it's not just those people, but there is the capacity for evil within me, then
mm,
that will change you and you will have a different outlook.
mm. Yeah, because that links and then I'll pass it to you, Daniel. I know you're waiting. That links to as Daniel was talking before too, like so much of what's being talked about sort of interpersonally, it also just sounds like the intrapsychic conflict as well, like it's reflected inside as well. And I think that is what I find so powerful, I guess, as well about this kind of therapy, is just the noticing that we are not just one thing, I guess, is the best way of saying it. Like there's so many things can be happening all at once, and they can be in conflict, and there can actually be things happening that you are adamant are not happening, and then somehow, 40 minutes later, you're like, oh, that was happening. I just like, so, they're just, it's very interesting. Anyway, yeah.
No, magnificent. So there's a few things. First, the thing ultimately that we are trying to get out of distortion of is the apathetic core at being that is an overflow of an excess of basically being that we are trying to actually overcome, which is that lack. Some people call it lack. Some people call it like the bright abyss. Some people call it sort of this thing that you cannot put into words, but seems to be the highest point of reality. And the moment you put into words, you would lose it. And there's something there that almost is, it is something that is a lack because it is, as Mr. Ebert would say, it is a radical excess. It's the fullness of life, and thus it exceeds your finite frame to comprehend it. Therefore, it seems like it's nothing. That's where Orthodox will talk about God as apathatic, as the nothing, right? It would seem to be ultimately that reality orbits an apathatic center. And that basically, to make another giant claim, we have structured, so we basically structured the modern world according to scarcity in terms of economics. As a result, economics has moved away from the well-being of the person and been more so about the material well-being. The new economy will have to center on lack, which is a negation, sublation of scarcity, which is going to include the psychoanalytical in the material, in the fullness. Now, a few more things. One of the great debates that occurred was between Leibniz and Descartes, where Leibniz looked over at Descartes and he said, Descartes, there are no individuals. There are only relations. Geometry is more primary than algebra. Algebra is an abstraction of geometry. When you look at the world, you don't see any object outside of a situation. It is relations all the way down. So when you talk about the individual, it is only, as Deleuze said, the individual. There, you are not, like when Hume is saying there is no self, he's saying you are a collection. He's not saying there's no you. He's saying that there is no self that isn't relational. And then you as relations are in relations with others. Now, that doesn't mean because of your finite frame, you don't see one thing at once. Like this is the issue. You experience things because you're finite. The brain couldn't handle experiencing everything at once, right? But the things then is kind of virtual. It is an impression of experience that is required for you to make it intelligible. So to put this another way, if I looked at this room and literally experienced everything in it at the same time, my brain would blow up, right? You have to, in order to make the world intelligible, experience things more sequentially or one at a time, or as if the bookcase is just the bookcase, not also the atoms and the parts, right? So it's how the brain works. Well, that right there suggests the whole apathetic thing, because everything around you is actually kind of apathetic. It actually strikes you as a thing when there's way more to it that isn't there, that's more like nothing. But not because it's nothing, but because it's an excess to your frame. You see? So this seems to be how we're constantly experiencing. The problem with philosophy, and this is what, so what you were saying, philosophy has not been in honor of something apathetic. It's been in honor of a being, or what is being, or what is truth as present. As a result, it's become totalitarian. It's become power-based. But if instead, like David Hume is saying, that philosophy always has to honor something that it can never put into words, then you're pointing at philosophy that is in service of removing our distortion of the experience of the apathetic, of the thing of which exceeds our scope, so that we can better experience it. Now, I think also we were talking about the subconscious. So to me, a lot of the experience, because on this question, like when we're asking, how do people navigate, right? Like, how should people live their lives? We talked about fear and courage and different things. The question of how people should navigate their lives or live their lives, or what society should do, is all going to be relative to what is the optimal experience that human beings are looking for, right? And if that optimal experience seems to be something that cannot be put into words because it's apathetic, then the question becomes, okay, what are the things that you need to do to create an increase of probability that average people have those kind of apathetic experiences? Because there also seems to be something about experiences with the apathetic that makes people more mentally healthy. It's the exact opposite of what you think. Once they know that there is something that exceeds them, there's a freedom in that because they don't have to control everything. And once they also experience that thing as beautiful and good, then they're also wanting to be alive to increase their encounter with that. And the way I think about it is kind of like the artist. The way this experience, the experience we seem to be looking for, which I think comes out in psychotherapy because I think it's an art, is the creative act. And what's so interesting about the creative act is when you're writing a story, and you really are writing a story, which is like the orgasm. You can't put it into words, but you know it when you do it. You forget yourself. It's like you return. So we were talking about the subconscious being a problem. The subconscious controlling you is the banality of evil. But then if you move into the conscious, you can go crazy because you have to choose everything. So the negation sublation of both is what I call the phenomenology of the artist. It is what you see in the creative act that's like the flow state. The flow state is like the subconscious, but it's actually an abundance of consciousness that is so well trained and excessive that it is like the apathetic, and you're fully in a situation that is inherently relational because you're relating with the story or you're relating with the players on the basketball field. Timothy Keller, the way he described this is self-forgetful, because he wrote a really good book called The Freedom of Self-Forgetfulness. And he was asking this question, okay, we know it's a problem to be selfish, but then you can be selfless where you're a doormat. So that's no good. So what are we looking for? He's like, well, we need to think about self-forgetfulness. How to increase a state where you actually forget yourself, just like you use yourself, but you don't think about yourself, just like your thumb. You use your thumb without thinking about it, right? So how do we become self-forgetful? And it seems to be that humans are most healthy or most kind of optimal when they're able to not be controlled by their subconscious, but to live their life in a manner where they're predominantly self-forgetful. And here's the key. If you are self-forgetful, you are relationally focused because you're looking outward, right? You're looking beyond yourself. So the self-forgetful is where you get to some sort of conditioning of yourself, where you forget yourself, that increases your openness to the excess, the relation, which then increases your attunement with the apathetic core of being that then is creatively overflowing. And it definitely seems that the key emotional disposition to this occurring is courage. Courage seems to be the creative act. The artist is courageous. There's something courageous about it. There's courageous about going to the psychotherapy. The Bible says the one who fears is not made perfect in love. It would seem that there's something about fear. Fear is basically, one could almost say that, Ebert said this once, that the meaning of life is courage. Seems to be a lot of truth to that, because courage seems to be the state of self-forgetfulness that then attunes you to that apathetic, that makes you relational, therefore more geometrical than algebraic, therefore more in a flow state, and therefore the idea and the concept and the percept, all of these and the experience are all coming together in a creative act. So I would say that the thing that we're working to avoid distortion of is this creative act, that you know it when you're in it. Some people in dialogos talk about how time goes by and you don't know what happened. You're in the creative, things go by. There's a flow with the patient. Those are the experiences we have to optimize for. That, and then to close the point, and I'll pass it on. Basically, politics, community, economics, sociology, all of these things, if pluralism isn't going to kill us all, we have to figure out how to increase the training and increase the probability that the average person is able to enter into that space with otherness, and to actually see it as an intensification of that apathetic and self-forgetfulness, which I would also finally associate with beauty, because this is all to increase beauty in the world. And I do think that basically the fate of beauty is the fate of us. If we can't figure this out, then the fate is not so good. If we can, then the fate of beauty is the fate of us in a more positive way.
Mm-hmm. So it's arriving at the suchness of self rather than the isness of self.
Beautiful, beautiful. Absolutely.
Yeah, that's my favorite definition of passion, by the way. It's forgetting of the self. You can't be passionate and self-conscious at the same time. But I would wager that in the act of self-forgetfulness, in the act of true passion or creativity, you're never more yourself. It's actually a massive affirmation of the individual. So even though I agree that it's all relational, I think there's more to the story, because what is in relationship to the other, if not individual? So
Like the apple skin, isn't it? Isn't it like Isn't it like the apples again? It's like in the
Yeah, the
somehow,
Leibniz. Yeah.
yeah. In the letting go of self. It actually it points out the self more. You jump in, Daniel.
No, it's exactly right, because the thing that this all shows is the self is itself in its relation. The self, the individual isn't it exists to be a relating thing. So the only way to be an individual is in relation, because it is ontologically relational, to use a lot of like the act of forgetting yourself is when you are yourself, because the self is a thing that is meant to forget itself. Like that's what it is. And so you become your full self in excess of your ideas of yourself. That's the trick. Like you're always in excess of your frame of reference, and it's in relation that you're actually emotionally participating in that truth, not merely thinking it. So the relation then emotionally attunes you to the fact that you are in excess to what you think you are.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the courage, though, too. See, it's the courage to let one's thoughts go, like to step out of that realm, in order to experience, right? That actually you could experience more deeply when you let that go.
Which can be a big ask, a tall order, because to sink into that, into the somatic, into the emotional, that's where all your old heartbreaks are, your profound disappointments, your rage, your love, your all of that, all of your appetites, it's all there. And so it's a hell of a ride.
Well, in that sense, it should be noted that basically what David Hume and many of the counter-enlightenment people are saying is that philosophy is about training for the surprise. It's about encountering the unexpected. And that is, like, if it's a question of what should people be optimizing for, in a way, then it's going to actually, because it's like we can talk like about having courage for relationships. Well, I would wager that everyone thinks they are courageous and are ready for relationships. So how do you actually test to find out if you are or not? Well, there's basically only one way. It's the question of how you respond to the unexpected. Like, what do you do when you are forced to confront something you had no idea of? The funny thing is, ideas are meant to be used when there was no idea of. This is why modern philosophy is so problematic, because it's about having ideas ready for anything that occurs. No, the true test of ideas is your ability to think of something you never thought before or never encountered before. It's more like the cipher improvisation, the artistic act, the unexpected. And you see, the problem is we design our lives to never be uncomfortable, to never encounter limit, to never encounter surprise, and therefore we're not tested to actually see if we've done the work, to have the courage, or to actually relate. It turns out that we actually most of the time are only relating with people we have ideas of ahead of time. Well, that means we're not actually relating. We're relating with ourselves, our ideas, through another person we're projecting on, right? So basically everything becomes kind of about what happens in the surprise. What happens when something occurs you weren't expected? And that's the real test. And then if that's the case, then everything becomes a distinction we made in the and then I'll pass it in the Parallax course on Ivan Illich, is the difference between planning and preparing. You know, we are led to believe that an educated, rational person is someone who has a plan. But plans are kind of totalitarian, and you leave out details. And if you think that being educated means having a plan, you're in huge trouble. And you, by definition, are probably fragile, and you're probably going to avoid difference. The key is to be prepared. Prepared means you don't have to know what's going to occur, but whatever occurs, you can handle it. And in fact, you can incorporate it into something more beautiful or use it for diversity or different things. And so a lot of the prerequisite in terms of the pragmatics, the pragmatism of what this would look like, it would look like a society that is emphasizing preparedness versus plannedness, which would be a lot more creative, a lot more being able to reflect on your own mental models, to reflect on your own self-defense mechanisms, so that, because they all pop up, like, because kind of like evolutionarily, what do we do when we encounter surprise? Defense, philosophy is about you having surprise and stopping the defense. That's when it's best. That's what it's supposed to do. But in fact, what we did is made it one giant plan, how to plan the perfect society, how to plan the modern world. So philosophy for the last long time has been in the exact opposite business of what it should be, which is more of the ability to be prepared and to stop yourself from defending, to be open, and so on and so forth. So the surprise, I think, is a big test.
Well, that's very helpful. I didn't know that. But my mind goes to Jiddu Krishnamurti, who said that it's about freedom from the known.
Mm.
That's what you're
Mm.
talking.
That's lovely.
At the same
Yeah,
time, we need bearings.
no, go, yeah.
We need some reference points. We need some bearings. So I think the idea is not to devalue the realm of knowledge in that sense, but to be able to hold it loosely and not to be overly attached to it, and to have flexibility in our ideas and perceptions.
Yeah, I'm thinking like the courage to be creative is what we're talking about here too, right? Like this is the, yeah. And that to be creative, it is the getting out of one's own way to some extent. That is the trying to bring down the more so the thinking process and entering into something that is more wordless. And that the overthinking can throttle, right, the possibility of what is there to create. Like it gets in the way of the creativity. Yeah, and this and it's the same point I went back to at the start actually. I've been thinking a lot, Daniel, about what you said about the like the clearing function of thought, that thought is a bit like can be used in a sophisticated manner, more like a clearing function in order to then have the experience, like to in order to then, like, yeah, I guess we call it emotional. But there's the role too of anxiety in all of this. I guess I'm just grappling with, outside of a therapy context, how on earth is someone supposed to hear any of this and sort of do anything about it? When it seems like, if I'm putting it at least in a framework of how this relates to therapy and a psychoanalytically informed therapy, then it seems like a large part of the task here is making the unconscious conscious. And how is a person going to just sit there and do that on their own, essentially?
We have
You
job
know, hey, what was that?
we have job security.
That's right. You know, like even as a psychologist, you know, I was working in models of therapy where there was none of that. You know, there's all sorts of therapy going on out there that's not touching the unconscious. I mean, to some extent, sure, the relationship and stuff is as a secondary effect, but it's not, you know, the therapist isn't often consciously aware of that. So it is like, if we're thinking, I guess, if you take it to more of a level of culture, like which again I know is a huge question, but what is like, what are the implications here in terms of, you know, how does one build bringing the unconscious into the conscious realm? How does one build that into culture? I mean, that seems like everything we're defended against as a culture. And this again links to, I guess, what I was harping on about last time with Daniel, just this. And I know that this isn't all like client presentations, but when I think about the people who are so like held on to their very intellectual thinking faculties and very certain and sure because of it, and how much of that is reinforced out there currently. It just, yeah, like what are the models of how this could be better integrated into community? That is, I guess, the question.
Well, it's a difficult
Against,
sales pitch.
you
It's
know,
a very tough
yeah.
sales pitch. It's like go on and give up trying to feel better for the moment so you can actually get better. But in order to do that, you have to face all this painful stuff. You know, it's really the pleasure principle yielding to the reality principle. That's a big ask. Most people structure their lives to just feel better for the moment as opposed to really getting better, which requires facing pain. It's a tall order, tough sales pitch.
And there is also this thing around sort of like a toxic comfort is the way I've talked about it before, of you know, like a position now where people are almost competing for the role in which they should be comforted by the other, like the sort of victimization kind of Olympics. You know, there's I guess a broader yeah, a broader illness going on is how I would frame it, around actually the thing I want to collect is comfort, and I want it right now. It's not even, I mean, I guess maybe that leads to them feeling good, but it may not even be, it's a competition for comfort, which gets in the way then of people being able to individuate and no longer just be a little child who's being comforted by their mother. Like it's, but it seems to be being reinforced that this is the healthy state to be in. And if you have any difficulty or challenge, it's because of someone else has got in your way, and everyone should rally around you and comfort you in that. So there's that as well. I just and yeah, I wonder about what this is pointing to in terms of how it's all gone so wrong, and then what something different would look like, if we can even imagine that. I mean, are we all meant to just sort of be speaking in poetry? Like there seems to be something important here about the role of the unspeakable stuff, like the ineffable. And you know, obviously that is why we use things like metaphor, and we have things like the arts, and you know, it is the eliciting of that experience for people. I think that's why it feels so rewarding for people. So, but that is just so at odds with the person who is, I guess, of the mindset that everything good and true and real should be able to be like written down and sort of perfectly structured, and there should be a clear map and a plan. And yeah, I don't know, what does that mean? What is the implication there then for how people could be living and aren't now?
Daniel, you look like you're bursting at the seams. Go for it.
This is Daniel's realm. I feel
No,
like he's being very
so
polite.
are you telling me the answer is not for us all to get Taco Bell, go to our basement and play video games? Because I think I can petition them to bring back that gray
For a
hot
day.
sauce. Like, you know, because that really hot sauce they had in the 90s before it was illegal, if we beg, they'll bring it back, because I have some Taco Bell stories, so I'm ready. Maybe we'll get the arcade machine. It'll be great. I think you've asked a million really wonderful questions. It was either Kierkegaard or Pascal who said that I think it was Kierkegaard, no, Pascal, he said all of the world's problems can be summed up in the fact that the average person cannot sit in a room by themselves alone for 3 minutes. And that gets at a lot of it. So there's a few things. So you talked about anxiety, the victim Olympics, et cetera, so forth. There's a number of dynamics that are at play that I think are contributing to all of this. So first off, Ivan Illich warned that we live in a society of disablement. And what that means is that we are disabled from doing anything. Now, the reason we're disabled, though, is because of convenience. So an example is we can't hunt anymore. Well, why can't we hunt? The average person hunt because you have the grocery store. So you don't experience your disablement as disablement, actually. You don't even notice you're not able to hunt because you can access food, right? Well, likewise, you actually, because you have the cell phone, you can text people, you don't know you're disabled from your ability to communicate with people using your voice and call them. Like, I call people, you would think that I have like committed some sort of crazy sin. It's like, what are you doing? It's like, I don't know what to do with my thumbs, right? So people don't even know they're disabled from the ability to use their voice, right? Because here's the problem. when you receive a technology or a service that provides the thing, you don't experience yourself as disabled. You experience yourself as very enabled because you have the store and you have the cell phone. The more disablement a society has, the more anxious it is because it's fragile, actually. And the anxiety is a result of those moments when you encounter the thing that you're disabled from doing it, but the technology or the store or the service or the expert is not there to help you. And so your anxiety tends to increase with those little slippages that occur here and there that train you to realize that, oh my gosh, I can't really do anything, right? Or because you're also disabled, like, pluralism is inherently an experience of disablement because you realize, wow, I don't know how to deal with real difference. Like that right there has a trauma that you cannot escape, right? Well, then you just make it even worse if all of the conveniences of modern society then make you feel like you have no skills or abilities whatsoever. So what do people then identify with tremendously? Their job, their occupation, because I know I'm enabled there. I get paid for it. But here's the problem. Their identity then is very tied to one thing. So that's fragile as well. And then they retire and they don't know what to do. And then, yeah, I mean, we saw it where a lot of people, complain about work, but then when they're home, they don't know how to interact. So they want to be at work. So they're actually work has a function of giving you status while hiding your disablement. So there's an entire socioeconomic structure that is in play here. It's very interesting. We also in America, particularly, we don't have a hobby culture anymore. Like you had people that would just do word working or would go fish, like literally learn how to fish, not just luxury, but like learn it or learn skills. So, what Ivan Illich discusses is we no longer have a subsistence society. We've lost subsistence. And and the thing is about learning a skill. Like you can say, well, why learn word working if you can just buy it from Akira or a store? Or Akira is a Japanese anime movie. I was trying to say the other thing.
I like that.
Walmart. It was good. It's a crazy movie. I remember that. It's Walmart. The problem is the act of learning how to make a table is an emotional experience that trains you to, we were talking about. So basically, we were saying earlier, in addition to, it's not going to do to have ideas if you don't have processes of kind of learning and going through emotions, right? Well, a way to look at skills or learning how to hunt or learning how to do tables is that it wasn't just about the product. It was only the gaining of a certain confidence in yourself or an ability to do something, right? Well, the problem, this is where Nick Land and all of it comes in, because the problem now is if there's something about subsistence as the general category that Ivan Illich is talking about, that is tied to the ability of people to be less anxious and more confident in themselves, well, guess what? You now have to basically be seen as doing something stupid because you could just go to the store. You could just use the technology. So the problem is now a lot of the practices that human beings need to do to help emotionally attune themselves to confidence are actually irrational or silly or a waste of time. Like, let's take a conversation like this. Is anyone getting paid? Is anyone academic? For the majority of people, this is actually seen as kind of silly, as like a waste of time, right? Well, that's part of what Ivan Illich wants to get at, is that the very this is where ideas get you in trouble. The very rationality of the society would then have you structure yourself to be more disabled. That makes you more dependent on maybe your job where you get your identity. Well, now you're a cog in the capitalist machine, right? And you're fragile, right? And then you struggle to have relationships with people, which then, not to sound too much like a Marxist or something like that, if your relationships in your communities are bad, well, then you get pleasure from what? Consumerism. And then why would you deal with the reality principle is kind of tied to a lot of the things that are found in relationships or enablement or higher things. Well, those are all irrational now. You don't need to do that. So the only rational exercise of the human subject now is according to the pleasure principle, right? And everything that is rational and enabling is in turns with the pleasure principle. And if without the reality principle, you end up mentally fragile or anxious all the time, then the very rationality of the society is now stuck in a kind of Nash equilibrium or game theory dynamic that is leading to a suboptimal result for everyone. And so I think the disablement dynamic now, so the practical things that would mean, and then I'll pass it on. I don't have a cell phone. I don't like them. I think they destroy your brain. I think don't have a cell phone. I think you need to commit yourself to some sort of art or practice that everyone around you thinks is like silly, because that very act of saying, I'm going to do jujitsu or I'm going to write short stories, even if I never get published, because that's a kind of absolute choice, as I call it, that is non-rational. I don't want to call it irrational. By non-rational, what I mean is only you can understand in the doing of it, that then creates a confidence in the development of a certain art that cannot be reduced to market forces, and therefore enables your ability to think outside of just what the structure is telling you to do, which then gives you enablement in yourself, which then can develop you to habits of courage that then increases the probability that you have openness to the other. So get rid of your cell phone. I think the other thing that I like is especially the smartphone. I mean, a dumb flip phone for work, I understand, but the smartphone basically means you're never alone in a room for 3 minutes, right? Because we're talking about the hard stuff, facing the subconscious. How can you ever face the subconscious if you always have a really cute cat video to watch, right? Like, how can you ever do that, right? So stuff like that. I think the other thing I like is I call it the unarmored test. And what I mean by the unarmored test, and Raymond, and then I'll pass it on. I think I said that 3 times and have not passed it on, so I'm sorry. But, Raymond talks about themos. And the notion in the classical world, it's very interesting. The greatest warrior went on the battlefield without any armor. Armor was like, you wore armor if you were less confident, right? You actually went on without armor. That was more thymotic. So ask you, the unarmored test is the following. Could you go visit your neighbor without a cell phone, without watching a sports game, just sitting across the table from them, and could you actually have a good time? Yeah. Like no armor, no technology, no thing to watch, just them. Your ability to create, and which is very conversational, of course, is very dynamic, very relational. You need to put yourself in unarmored circumstances, like circumstances where you have nothing but the relation or the thing that you are encountering, because that's the test on yourself as a subject for your own enablement that then actually addresses the thymos. With that as well, I would also, I think there's actually significant educational reform that would come with this as well, because I think there's a lot of armors in education that teaches people that they can be educated in a professional in manners that avoids facing the unarmored space that is encountering the subconscious and so on. But I'll pause there.
That's the defense mechanisms as well, right? That's the armor.
Yes.
At least honest that I'm thinking as he talks about armor. It's in order to have the most contact with the other, it's the bringing down your own internal armor as well, like your perceptual distortions, if we put it that way. Johannes, is there anything that you're thinking about?
Well, just that the cell phone in this case, or the cat videos, they become the defense mechanism to distract ourselves or pursue pleasure in the service of avoiding something. So that's not it. But I really enjoyed that. Lovely exposition.
Well, and I should just note just quickly as well, and I appreciate that, Johannes, is that we were talking earlier about self-forgetfulness and flow. If you can go into battle per se without armor, like you have skills and ability, then you never leave flow. Because flow is a result often of you encounter something that makes you reflect back on your inadequacy. So the unarmored test is tied to the flow and the self-forgetfulness that makes us most attuned to the apathetic. So, for example, if you don't know how to use a chainsaw and you go to your neighbor's house and a tree has fallen, your inability to use a chainsaw becomes very pronounced, and you reflect on yourself as inadequate, right? Now, obviously, we as human beings cannot learn every possible skill known to man, so it is inevitable that we are snapped out of our flow state and therefore have the philosophy to think ourselves back into the flow state as a way to think. The role of philosophy is to get us back into self-forgetfulness, which is going to inevitably occur when we encounter our limits, the things we don't have. But if you know that your ability to stay in self-forgetfulness is tied to not encountering your inability, then you're going to want to learn how to talk, because it's a pretty high probability you're going to have to talk with people. You're going to want to learn how to sit alone in a room with people, because there's a pretty high chance you're going to sit in a room alone with people. Cutting down a tree depends on where you live. Maybe there's a 10% chance, an 80% chance. You start doing a risk-benefit assessment, going down all of these different things, and you say, there's a high chance I'm going to have to interact with children at some point. So I'm going to learn how to tell a story because I don't want to encounter the fact that I'm boring. I don't want to encounter the fact that I need a freaking DVD right now and that I'm dependent on technology to entertain children, right? I don't want to encounter that because I want to stay in the flow. So you start going down your head thinking according to, given my circumstance of what do I do? What are things that if I learn how to do or enable myself in this way, which by the way, learning how to tell stories that children like is a bodily emotional processing that in of itself helps you work through things, well, then that increases the probability you'll be able to stay in a state of self-forgetful when you're with children flow. Oh, and by the way, when human beings are snapped out of their flow, what are they more probable to get into? Drama, conflict, anger, because when you reflect on your inadequacy, you tend to say, well, it's your fault. The kids are doing something wrong, or my partner's doing something wrong. So the ability to stay in the flow, if you will, also decreases the probability that you're going to enter into drama and different things. But notice here, you are not avoiding drama. In fact, the reason you learn these skills or you thought these things through is precisely because you accepted the fact that it is extremely probable that if you reflect on yourself, you will be a monster. So it requires a certain accepting of your dark side to do all of this, right? So that's why it's not an avoidance. It's actually precisely from the place of knowing that you are probably quite monstrous when you reflect on yourself and your inadequacy. So then you're going to work on yourself. And that's where you're taking the themos to incorporate the dark side into a light side of self-forgetfulness as well. So those things for me connect.
Most people don't want to do that though. This is like, especially not to reflect on the monstrous part of themselves. And there's again, there's the anxiety here that I think is problematic with, as part of the defense, as part of the armor. That is part of the armor that I think people, or depending where they are at, people see anxiety as a very real sign that they should step away, that they should avoid. And the idea that you could just say that's defensive armor, like put that down, is not. Well, I mean I think that is very difficult in all of this. And that does directly speak to culture too, though. I think response to anxiety, like what we're supposed to do in the face of anxiety, is a real problem. But I'm hearing, like, again, I'm hearing a lot of like, on the one hand, the getting comfortable with being able to be in silence is obviously very important here, either alone, like with oneself, or with another person. But then also being able to see speech and the voice as something very, profound and important, and also working on that. I like what you said though about developing a skill, having something. I think again it goes back to something that is not it's not only reliant on lots of thinking and lots of intellectualization and stringing sentences together, and it is more bodily, and to some degree there is the learning of the structure of it or the rules of it, and then there is the getting out of the way of that in order to engage in it in a way that is truly creative and that you're probably going to get most meaning out of. I mean, I guess I see that all the time in my husband. He builds things all the time, and it just seems like such a, I mean, mostly bookcases for my books, to be fair, but it seems like such a peaceful kind of, like a getting out of the way of oneself, to just be able to immerse yourself in that, which seems very different. There's a quality to it that seems very different to just like an avoidance. And so trying to decipher that difference is interesting as well. Yeah, I still think anxiety is a difficult one. It's a signal that a lot of people are highly motivated to get away from. I don't know if you have thoughts about that, Johannes.
Well, yeah, back to the idea that it's a tall order. It's a difficult sales pitch to encourage people to face anxiety-laden psychic material or even external situations that are anxiety-provoking. But I think that what we have in our quiver as leverage is the idea that if you stay in your comfort zone, that's antithetical to growth. There will be
Yeah.
no growth in your life. There will be no genuine intimacy. You might
Mm,
have the semblance of togetherness in real relationships, but you're ultimately alone behind your defenses, behind your walls. So do you
mm,
want to be on your deathbed and you've lived relationally speaking and even intrapsychically speaking, often a crippled life? Do you really want to be that person who's on their deathbed? They haven't actually stepped out of their comfort zone, their silo, their cocoon. So there's no
mm.
real relating, there's no real growth, there's no real togetherness or intimacy if you don't. So I think that's our leverage when it comes to what you and I do in the therapy room.
Yes, and that is the message that I like. How would that be translated more broadly into culture? Like, 'cause that is the message that like talking to people about intimacy, opening up, not being crippled. Um, so even the word intimacy, I don't think people know what that even means, like even that as a term, nor see that as an important goal necessarily. Um, I mean, I think that they would probably just think that you're talking about sex and that that's what, that's it.
Yeah,
Um,
don't use
and
the euphemism for sex.
sorry, what was that?
Don't use the word as a euphemism for sex or just
No,
feelings. Yeah.
no, I know. But I think for many people that, yeah, the idea of intimacy as being something that could be an important thing to cultivate. I think most people, actually, this goes back to, I think, what you said, Daniel, earlier. Most people, I think, if you said that, would be like, oh, I've got no problems with intimacy. Like I think everyone just draws a line under it. They just think everything's fine, whatever level of connection they're operating at for many people. Um,
Mm-hmm.
yeah,
The
yeah,
point of entry, Aspasia, that I have found
mm,
to be the most effective in terms of helping people turn that ship around is when they become aware of the pain of being alone. It
mm,
seems to be something universally quite painful for most of us.
mm,
And some people are really good at tuning that out. But insofar as you can help someone see that they're actually alone, there's like some sense of togetherness, but there's no genuine togetherness. Like we're not actually in contact. That's often a very powerful point of entry to help people decide to forego some of their habitual ways of avoiding things and sticking the head in the sand.
mm. That's a good point. That seems to be the word as well. That seems to be when I point that out, that seems to, yeah, have quite a shift. I think that that seems like quite a lonely experience for you. Like even the pointing out that it has taken a long time for them to share something with me, or that they, acknowledge they have feelings in not sharing with someone else in their life. Like the pointing out of how that leads to loneliness or disconnection or a holding back.
Mhm.
Right. I think, yeah, you're right. Then the pain of that, right, that then allows the pain of that to become more apparent. And
Yeah.
then the experiencing of the pain of that is more likely, I guess, to link to the initial kind of set of injuries, if we put
Mhm.
it that way. Or like it's yeah, and then that is, so what you're saying is that you've found that that is quite a motivating force in terms of now wanting to be able to work towards
Mhm.
better connection, better intimacy.
Well, it becomes the motivating force to give up status quo. Yeah.
Right, right.
Yeah, like sometimes I'm looking at a patient and they're guarded in their own way. There's 1,001 ways of being guarded, but they're guarded in their own way. And I might say to them, do you realize that you're the most important person in my life for this whole session? There's nothing but you. I'm undividedly focused on you, and yet you're alone. Like, do you realize that? And so that often is a point of entry where people can begin to experience the pain of the status quo.
Mm. And I imagine too, though, for so many people, that is just such a foreign, even the pointing out of that is such a foreign thing to hear from anyone. Like in terms of the nature of their existing relationships, if they
Mhm.
are, say, at a highly intellectual level, or to
Mhm.
even have someone sit and notice that about them and to say that in that manner, and then to just leave it with them without the then like providing the suite of options of how they might then, fix that, which, like just the leaving it there in the space.
That's right. That's right. It's often quite.
Mm,
Um, Daniel
mm.
goes through that.
Well, everything y'all both said was just absolutely magnificent. A few things. First, I'm really glad you brought up this idea on people not knowing how to respond to fear, because to me, the ground zero thing that philosophy is necessary for is to rightly interpret anxiety and fear. Like, you know how we were saying earlier, you would never think to question your love language without philosophy. Well, likewise, the problem is without philosophy, you never question if you should face your anxiety, or if you're in a kind of like habit of running from fear, why would you ever break that cycle without thinking? Now, when I say philosophy, I'm not just saying like, I don't mean by that studying Kant, studying Plato. Philosophy is the reflection of thought on thought, where you reflect on your thoughts. That's a way to think about philosophy. So for example, when you feel anxiety and the thought is run, philosophy is the act of saying, is that the right thought? It's a meta move. It has a meta move. The problem is now the word philosophy is always just kind of tied to the study of the history of philosophy. And I think that when we're talking about philosophy as the love of wisdom, the reason you do the meta move is because you love wisdom and you don't want to go into error. And error is a way of life. Like wisdom is a way of life. It's not just the right ideas. It's the right way to live, which has a lot to do with facing fear, basically, because, in a lot of religions, wisdom is the fear of the Lord, right? Or it's tied to the opposite of fear. Now, the key to the fear of the Lord is that the fear of the Lord is you fear not following God more than giving into your fear, actually. Like you fear missing out on the fullness of reality more than actually not facing your fear, if you will, right? So that's kind of important there, because the funny thing is if you fear the Lord and then it turns out that the Lord's actually for you, then it turns out there's nothing to fear, right? So there's things to play on there, but the key is that there's a long tradition that basically wisdom has something to do with facing fear, like facing anxiety. And so philosophy has a lot to do with that as well. And so, but the problem is without philosophy, if you get in a habit of interpreting anxiety as something you run from, you would never break that habit because you would never do the meta move on it, unless you get a counselor or a therapy or a mentor or someone who basically would teach you philosophy without maybe calling it that, as I'm so describing it, as the meta move. And this is where mentors and coaches and et cetera can be a big deal. The other way to think about philosophy too is we're talking about intimacy here. Intimacy is kind of we forgetfulness. Not just, how we talk about self-forgetfulness. You are intimate with the person when you have a we forgetfulness. And most people think intimacy means you're intimate with the people you share pleasure in. They think sharing pleasure with someone means you're intimate with them. That is not the case. That's on the side. Intimacy is we forgetfulness, and it's going to be tied a lot to the ability to speak. Because if you're afraid to speak to someone, then you're not we forgetful because you're thinking about yourself. You know how we said fear makes you reflect and you lose the self-forgetfulness? Most intimacy is lost because of an anxiety of speaking, of saying something or opening up, right? Like you're not able to communicate. Now, I'm not saying that's just a verbal thing, but it has a lot to do with some sort of verbalness. Well, that means you can't have we forgetfulness. And that seems to be a lot. Another way to think about it is in Christianity, they talk about the Trinity, where God is three persons, one essence. Intimacy seems to be the ability to be multiple people, one essence. And that's kind of the we. And in that, the key is in the Trinity. The Son is lost in the Father, who's lost in the Holy Spirit, who's lost. They never think about themselves. They're lost in the other. And so God is an inherent community. God is not pure being. God is relation. Pure relation of pouring out of otherness into the other. And that seems to be what sex is supposed to represent, this kind of 2-1 Trinity kind of thing, but it's not necessarily that. That's the key, right? It depends on if you have, it could be we forgetfulness, but not necessarily. And then philosophy, then a way to think about it is, what do I need to do to have we forgetfulness? If we use that term, I'll just say intimacy, right? Now because that's a matter of positioning yourself, conditioning yourself in the right way so that you have we forgetfulness. So a way to think about this, I'll use that Owen Barfield example of the rainbow. If you want to see a rainbow, then you have to stand in the right position, be outside at the right time, and look in the right direction. There are certain conditions you have to meet to experience something that is not an illusion. This is the key. Owen Barfield is adamant about this. A rainbow exists independent of you. It is not merely subjective. nor is it an illusion. Other people could come out and meet those conditions and see the rainbow as well. To him, the rainbow is kind of the symbol of where all metaphysics and ontology should really focus on, because he thinks the rainbow is the revelation of all of reality. And that basically philosophy is the realization of what you need to do to experience the rainbow of we forgetfulness in this context, or the flow state, or the artistic act. The rainbow is the apathetic river hole. It is the apathetic opening we were talking about, right? It is not obvious when you look at reality what the conditions are that you need to meet to experience the rainbow, to have intimacy, to have courage. That's why you need thinking, because you can't just look and the world tells you what you need to do. It is not given in facticity. It's in the world, but it is not necessarily given to you like instructions in a manual, right? So you have to figure it out. And also, it changes relative to the particularities of the suchness you're involved in. The we forgetfulness between Sarah and John can be different from the we forgetfulness between Dave and Brian or something. Therefore, you have to actively think beyond mere pragmatism to something that's more fuller and emotional and taking everything into account. Otherwise, you cannot figure out how to meet the conditions to create the effect of the rainbow that is not mere opinion. It is an objective reality that emerges in an experience that two people, when they're in intimacy, know it. It's not reducible to taste. And yet it's also not the same as a coffee cup. It's very concrete, but it's not like a coffee cup. It's like a frickin' rainbow. You meet the conditions, and so you experience it together. And so the question is, what do you need to do to meet the conditions to have that be possible? And then also note that is enabling. That very activity is working against the zeitgeist of disablement to help you to a place of enablement to create this very intimacy. And so I think conditionalism, as I call it, is part of this. And philosophy has a lot to do with figuring out where I need to stand. Now, that would mean, though, that philosophy has a lot to do with awareness and attention. Because you were just saying, Johannes, so beautifully, like, I'm here giving you my full attention. The average person does not know how to focus on something or to give something attention or awareness. There is a war on attention. There's like the attentionalist economy is a war on attention. If the human being loses attention, we have no possibility of we forgetfulness. We have no possibility of learning the conditions we need to create the rainbow. There is a giant war on attention. Simone Weil talks about awareness as being central for otherness. Ian McGilchrist is talking about attention at the root of being. Ivan Illich talks about attention. So there is no we forgetfulness without the ability to give full attention to the other. You can't have the persons of the Trinity getting lost in one another without attention. So the question of creating at scale, Aspasia, what you were saying, how do you get at scale people facing anxiety, would be tied to a question of creating at scale the capacity for the average person to be able to give attention. That seems to have a lot to do with an education that is focused on training people how to face fear versus be right. Because the education system right now is about right answers, not about being courageous and learning the skills of attention. That is what I would say. For me, a lot of belonging, again, is going to say we need to move away from a trivia-based structure of education where we're learning the right answers so we get the random questions right. It's like Neil Postman talks about. We need to move away from the test to the oral test or the conversational structure, because that's relational. And also we need to move away from right answers to the ability to defend a position of something that you've never thought about before. You need to move away from memorization, because the problem is if school teaches you that an educated person memorizes, then you go into relationships looking to have all the right answers, and then when they don't fit into it, you get crushed. You're not prepared. So that would also mean, though, that you get rid of basically the college monopoly on credentials, because basically now that means people go to college to get a job versus go to education to become prepared for life, which actually would make them more competent for a job. That's the irony. When school is about getting people jobs, they're less prepared to work. They're actually less prepared for jobs because they're not the full human being that's anti-fragile to be able to handle the office space. And then you get all the different trauma. So I think for me, a lot of this is moving away from the trivia education structure, which is about getting random questions right, to moving to something much more oral-based, much more conversation-based, much more on the capacity of students to kind of talk to one another, the facilitation of those conversations. Because even if you're having a conversation about European history, the very medium of conversation versus the test is going to have a lot more emotional attunement, creative attunement, awareness, attention. So I think what we need to do is basically change the classroom.
Amen. You're singing my tune. I'm a Waldorf kid, so everything you just said
Oh,
seems
no way.
for alternative school like Waldorf or Montessori or whatever.
Yeah. No way.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's what I was steeped in. So
Wow. For
I
how long? Like, did you go like right through?
yeah, from kindergarten to 8th or 9th grade until I moved to the
Oh, wow.
US. Went to a normal high school here, public high school. So
Oh, wow. That would have been different.
that was an interesting move. Yeah, I felt like an alien.
I bet.
Well,
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
amazing. And I should just note, like, literally, we're training kids at an early age to be scared. You have the wrong
Mm.
answer. You don't know the answer. You're literally habituating them to associate thinking with anxiety. So they're not going to think; they're just going to consume. It's awful.
Well,
Mm.
beautifully put. Beautifully
You
put.
don't cover your mouth.
Yeah,
I let out a secret.
yeah. So I have to begin to wrap up. Any final commentary about any of this from either of you?
Mm.
What reverberate? If you had to pick one or two ideas, what reverberates the most in both of you? Yeah.
Well, I'm enjoying the emphasis on courage. Um,
Mhm. Mhm.
I'm still grappling with the problem of anxiety. But and the I guess the idea of well, it is a bit like payoff, like starting to shift from like in the moment pleasure to understanding that there is there is also time ahead for most people, and the idea of actually working through difficult stuff like that and that can still be in service of a kind of, I guess, a kind of pleasure. Um,
Mhm. Mhm.
I'm just still I guess cynical about the current like cultural water that everyone is swimming in. And I guess seeing the people that come into therapy, especially the younger that they are, just sort of more and more so there's just so much to dismantle from the get-go, it seems. There's this and almost like handing me they're not, but it feels like they're almost handing me a piece of paper of, here's what I read on Reddit about what's my problems are and what you need to do. And like just like they already have the solution. I'm not quite sure why they're there. There's just, I don't know, and everything being sort of reified as like mental illness now, the way it's talked about seems, oh, there's so much. There's so much. I'm supposed to be wrapping up, and I'm really just opening up new things. But I guess in wrapping up, um, the role of courage, the very I think intimacy as something that is not stressed enough out there. What we mean by intimacy, why that can be such a vital aspect of living. What how
Mhm.
to achieve it outside of just learning your love language.
Mhm.
Like what it really means, how one can achieve it, how one can have it with themselves, and how that translates to having it with an other. The falling away, I guess, of thinking and what I call words, and more of the sort of ineffable, the more emotion-based kind of experience. Um, and yeah, I guess that's sort of what where I'm at.
Mhm. Mhm.
Yeah.
Okay. How about
Daniel.
you, Daniel?
Everything you said was exactly on it. So I think
It would be another subject. There's a lot also on anxiety being a result of what Paul Tillich said, the lack of a courage to be and a lack of people owning an ultimate concern. of their own choosing, not in terms of a career or social acceptance, like an ultimate concern that would be a non-rational choice that you then fight for, that you stand for, even if like, you know, that calls something out of you and changes how you practically live your life. So Paul Tillich is quite interesting. I can't say I approve of all of his work, but some of that is quite good. I think the conflict of mind is going to talk about in the essay the conflict of mind. The essay called The Conflict of Mind is going to talk about the problem of internally consistent systems and pitch-in risks and conspiracies. And basically the problem is the world today is everywhere you look, there is a there's an internally consistent system that has the structure of a conspiracy that if you enter, you can't escape. It pulls you in forever, just like the Pitchin novel, The Crying of Lot 49. So in the Crying of Lot 49, a character believes there's a global conspiracy and there's this kind of trumpet that represents it. And she sees it everywhere and no one can convince her out of her and she's stuck. It's all internally consistent and completely coherent. And the conspiracy is the revelation of the character of the modern world. Conspiracies are highly rational. There's lots of evidence for them. They're completely internally coherent. They just don't correspond. Basically, what's ended up happening is children at a very early age are falling into internally consistent systems. They read something on Reddit, they interpret themselves. Of course, they see it everywhere. If you think you have X mental illness, then that's the lens by which you see reality. So, of course, you'll see evidence for it. If you believe that capitalism is going to kill us all, global warming, Trump, Biden, it doesn't take your pick of glasses that you put on and then can never escape. Like everyone, you know, there's that John Carpenter movie, They Live, where he wears the glasses and he sees that it's aliens everywhere, right? There is no mega structure. There is no like single mono conspiracy like that. The problem is there are now thousands of glasses that people put on and see thousands of different things that they don't have on, that then they're stuck in all of these internally consistent systems that they can't get out of. And that's leading to a kind of psychosis that is quite, and you know, that is quite dire and that people need to work out of. And so for me, what that means is as a parent or as a person, you've got to choose carefully what you think about. And for me, you need to choose to think about things that are in your suchness, that are falsifiable, that you can do something about, that has something to do with your relations, that will impact how you educate your children, how you use your free time, whether you buy that smartphone or not. Because the issue is, like when we're talking about these kind of global issues, like I was, the probability of maybe the UN watching this and going, well, what is happening? Freaking Putin, and they change and everything is not too high. But if your practical life will be impacted by how you interpret the global situation, right? Like you can't separate those things. So if you think that the educational classroom is contributing to anxiety and that it should be reformed, then you may educate your children differently. If you think that, say, global pluralism is necessary to avoid self-deception and all the other problems, then you may resist the temptation for a utopic nostalgia or an isolationism, and you won't vote that way, right? So your worldview has practical impact on you live, but here's the trick. Only have a view of the world to the degree that it trickles into your practical life, right? It must always come to the concrete. And I think that's what I would really kind of just stress is that it is very, very difficult to keep yourself in the realm of the things that you can control, that have some sort of effect on your relationships. It is so incredibly difficult as a human being to maintain self-forgetfulness, without which you certainly can't have we-forgetfulness and intimacy, that you must be very attentive, very aware to the choices you make and how you choose to interact and what you choose to think about and what to do. Now, I'm not saying to be, well, that sounds like the Amish, right? Don't think about anything, just close yourself off. No, make decisions like this. If you want to say, understand what's going on in China, instead of turning on the TV, read a book, because a book requires attention. Being aware of the mediums of information, that's where people mess up. If you want to learn about China, read some books, because that requires, McLuhan called that a cold medium because you had to turn on your brain to use it, not a hot medium, and it's less susceptible to destroy your faculties of attention and actually train them, right? What you choose to think and learn about, be aware of the ways it is delivered to you and what it calls forth of you to interact in it. And if you say, well, I don't want to read a book about China, well, then realize that that's the choice of not being concerned about China, right? And that's, that is the choice. You can't cheat, if you will.
Mm.
Now, I'm not saying that every news story or video or whatever about China is bad, but you're at least now meta aware of the medium structure. You're meta aware, like if you're using education in terms of a test, that is creating an indirect association of memorization with being educated. Is that what you want? Do you want the kids to have that indirect? Because that may then move them into personal relationships, trying to memorize all the answers as opposed to being beforehand versus being open to the other in the encounter. So be aware of that. So I would just say to be aware of everything in operation in the background, in the structure. Don't just pay attention to the information, pay attention to the medium of the information. Don't just pay attention to, are you and your friends having a good time? Pay attention to how you're having a good time. Are you having a good time because it's a great conversation or because you're watching a movie together? It's not bad to watch a movie every now and then, but if your relations are dependent on it, they may lack a reality principle. Pay attention to those things, because that will then function perhaps as a revelation of better ways to condition yourself for the possibility of intimacy in the rainbow. If you do not pay attention to these things, it is very unlikely you will meet the conditions for a rainbow.
Beautiful.
I love that point about the medium, like paying attention to the medium. I'm going to think on that a lot. That the medium, the reading about China rather than just watching something on TV also allows you to, there's a pace issue and a way in which you can wrestle with the information that is much more fitted to you. It's more fitted than something being presented to you in a particular with a particular pace, as an example. But the reading and the wrestling with something, it requires effort and much more attentional resources as well, right? So like what I'm thinking about, and then I'll wrap up. What I'm thinking about is like poetry as an example. Like the reading of a poem can be really frustrating as well, right? But like in the reading of it, it can evoke something else as well underneath that, which is oftentimes what people are seeking in all sorts of other sort of disposable, easy ways as well. But it's a medium through which you are having emotional experience that you choose to engage in, knowing that it's going to be harder. Like it's knowing that that's going to be harder than just turning on the TV. I think there's something about that, and it's linked back to the courage piece and the willingness to sit with discomfort and the not knowing, and is this going to be a waste of time, and is this just going to be like nonsense on the other side of it, and I experience nothing emotionally? Am I only going to be frustrated by it? I think all of those things, you take a risk and a gamble, and you invest something more in the process. And that's important, rather than just to turn on the TV and just have it presented to you and you can just move around.
Well,
Yeah.
we're being accelerated to death, as like
Yeah.
to reference Paul Virilio.
Virilio, like we're being accelerated to death. It's the logic of immediacy. And there's something about acceleration that's the opposite of intimacy, right?
Yeah.
So if all of society is training you into habits of acceleration and speed, then they are training you out of habits of the possibility of intimacy. So I would say pay attention to if your life is operated by a logic of acceleration and immediacy, because if so, it might not be your life. It might even your life might be conditioned by something else.
Wonderful. Beautifully put. For me, it's just hanging out, that reverberates, but getting to know both of you better and sharing thoughts. So that's what stays with me.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Johannes. Thanks, guys.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
You know.
All the best to you.